They were told Americans would burn them alive. That captivity meant torture, starvation, and a shame worse than death itself. But when 43 Japanese women stepped off that military transport truck in San Antonio, Texas on September 15, 1945, the enemy did something they never expected. An American sergeant knelt down in the Texas dust, pulled out a set of keys, and began unlocking the chains around their ankles. One by one, the metal fell away with a sound that would echo through the next 40 years. They had expected cruelty. Instead, they heard 5 words that would shatter everything they believed about the enemy, about honor, about what it means to be human. You are not animals. But before we understand why those words destroyed an entire worldview, before we discover what price that American sergeant paid to speak them, we need to go back. Back to a Tokyo classroom in 1985, where an elderly woman holds a piece of rusted chain and tells her students a truth so devastating, so transformative, that it changed the course of her entire life. Tokyo, Japan, spring 1985. The classroom fell silent as Yuki Tanaka stood before her students. At 60 years old, her hair had gone completely silver, but her eyes still held the fire of someone who had seen the world break apart and helped put it back together. In her weathered hands, she held a length of chain, rusted, heavy, the metal links stained dark with old blood and 4 decades of memory. 40 high school students stared at this chain confused. Their history teacher had never brought anything like this to class before. Always textbooks, always careful lectures. But today something was different. Today her hands trembled as she held the chain. September 15th, 1945. She began, her voice quiet but steady. They told us Americans would burn us alive. That captivity meant torture beyond imagination. That death would be a mercy compared to what awaited us. She paused, letting the weight of those words settle over the classroom like dust. I was 20 years old, a nursing assistant who had been captured in Manila when the city fell to American forces. For 6 months, I wore these chains. Every step I took, they reminded me that I was no longer human, that I was less than an animal, that I deserved whatever suffering came next. A girl in the front row raised her hand tentatively. Sensei, but the Americans, didn't they torture you? Wasn't that what happened to prisoners? Yuki looked down at the chain in her hands. Her fingers traced the links, feeling the rough metal, the places where it had rubbed against skin and bone and destroyed the illusion of invincibility. No, she said softly, they did something far more devastating than torture. They treated us like human beings, and that destroyed every lie we had ever been told. The students leaned forward, unable to look away. An American sergeant, Yuki continued, a man whose only son had been killed by Japanese forces just 6 months earlier, knelt before me in the Texas heat and unlocked these chains. And when I asked him why, when I demanded to know why he would show mercy to the people who had killed his boy, he gave me an answer that would haunt me for the rest of my life. She set the chain down on her desk with a heavy clank that made several students jump. He said, because that's who we choose to be. Yuki looked at each of her students in turn, making sure they understood the gravity of what she was about to tell them. What I'm going to share with you today is not in your textbooks. It's not the version of history you have been taught, but it's the truth. And if we don't learn from this truth, if we don't understand what happened in that Texas prison camp in 1945, then we are doomed to repeat the same mistakes that cost millions of lives. She picked up the chain again. This is the story of how I learned what civilization really means. How I discovered that mercy is not weakness, but the hardest kind of strength there is. How I came to understand that we are defined not by how we treat our friends, but by how we treat our enemies. The bell rang, but nobody moved. Nobody gathered their books or headed for the door. They sat frozen, waiting for their teacher to continue, because they could see in her eyes that this was not just another history lesson. This was something that had cost her everything to learn, and it had all started 40 years ago on a blistering September day in Texas when the world as she knew it began to crumble. Fort Sam Houston, San Antonio, Texas, September 15,945. The heat hit them like a physical wall, 95 degrees of relentless Texas sun turning the military transport truck into an oven on wheels. The canvas covering provided no relief. The metal benches underneath them radiated stored heat like a griddle. And the chains around their ankles, those cursed chains that had rubbed their skin raw over 6 months of captivity, now burned hot enough to brand. Yuki Tanaka sat wedged between two other women, all of them skeletal, hollow-eyed, dressed in torn and filthy uniforms that had once been crisp and clean. Her nursing assistant's outfit had become little more than rags. Sweat poured down her face, stinging her eyes, but she didn't dare raise her chained hands to wipe it away. Weakness invited punishment. That much she had learned. The truck lurched to a stop, throwing them against each other. Outside, American voices barked orders in that harsh, incomprehensible language. English, the tongue of the enemy. The language of devils, or so she had been told. The canvas flap was thrown back, flooding the truck bed with blinding sunlight. Yuki squinted her eyes, struggling to adjust after hours in the dim interior. An American soldier gestured impatiently for them to move. No words, just a sharp hand motion that needed no translation. Get out, now. One by one, the 43 women shuffled toward the tailgate. The chains around their ankles allowed only tiny steps, maybe 6 inches at a time. Clank, shuffle, clank, shuffle. The sound of imprisonment, of dehumanization, of being reduced to something less than what they were. Yuki's turn came. She stood at the edge of the tailgate, looking down at the ground that seemed impossibly far away with her feet shackled. A young American soldier, barely more than a boy, stepped forward and offered his hand to help her down. She flinched, expecting a blow, but he just stood there, hand extended, waiting patiently. Slowly, she took his hand. His skin was warm, human. Not the cold touch of a monster, but the ordinary warmth of another person. He helped her step down, steadying her when the chains made her stumble. "Easy, ma'am," he said in English. She didn't understand the words, but the tone was gentle. That couldn't be right. She must be imagining things. The ground beneath her feet was hard-packed, Texas dirt, baked solid by the unforgiving sun. Around her, the other women were being helped down from the truck with the same unexpected care. No shouting, no violence, just methodical efficiency. Yuki looked around, trying to understand where they were. This was Fort Sam Houston, she would learn later, a massive military installation sprawling across the flat Texas landscape. In every direction, buildings stretched toward the horizon, not bombed-out ruins like Manila, not the devastation she had become accustomed to seeing. These buildings stood intact, freshly painted, maintained. The windows reflected the afternoon sun, whole and unbroken. American flags snapped in the hot wind, the sound crisp and sharp. Mesquite trees dotted the landscape, their twisted branches providing sparse shade. The sky overhead was a blue so pure and deep it seemed impossible. No smoke, no ash, just endless, perfect blue. And then the smell hit her. Not the stench of death she had expected, not the acrid burn of destruction, something else entirely. Something that made her stomach clench with a hunger so fierce it hurt. Mesquite smoke, rich and woody, and underneath that, the unmistakable scent of grilling meat. Barbecue. Someone somewhere on this base was cooking food. Real food. The smell was so overwhelming, so impossibly tantalizing after months of moldy bread and thin gruel, that several women actually swayed on their feet. The sound came next. Not screams of the tortured, not the chaos of battle. Country music drifted from a distant radio, tinny but cheerful. Somewhere an American soldier laughed at something his companion said. The ordinary sounds of people going about their day, as if the world hadn't just torn itself apart in the Pacific. It was all wrong, all of it. This was supposed to be hell. This was supposed to be where they paid for their nation's sins, where the enemy exacted revenge for years of brutal warfare. But instead, it looked like life. Normal, mundane, incomprehensibly normal life. Akiko Sato, the oldest among them, at 45, stood next to Yuki. Her face was carved from stone jaw, clenched tight eyes scanning for threats. During the voyage from the Philippines, she had been their rock, their source of strength, when despair threatened to overwhelm them. Do not show weakness. Akiko had told them over and over. Do not cry. Die with dignity if you must, but give them nothing. Now Akiko's mask showed the first hairline cracks of confusion. Because this place, these Americans, they didn't fit the narrative. They didn't match the propaganda that had sustained the women through 6 months of captivity. The 43 women stood in a ragged group in the blazing Texas sun chains, preventing them from moving more than small, shuffling steps. The youngest among them, Hana Yamamoto, was barely 19 years old. Tears already streamed down her face, silent and unstoppable. She had been crying on and off for months, ever since Manila fell. Some people broke loudly. Hannah broke quietly, one tear at a time. An older sergeant stepped forward from the line of American soldiers. He was tall, broad-shouldered, maybe in his early 40s. His face was weathered like old leather, tanned dark by years under the Texas sun. Gray streaked his temples beneath an Army regulation haircut. Deep lines framed his eyes and mouth, the kind of lines that came from squinting against harsh light and carrying heavy burdens. He wore the same uniform as the others, but something about the way he carried himself set him apart. This was a man who had seen things, done things, lost things. It was written in every line of his face and the way his shoulders carried an invisible weight. Sergeant Thomas Williams stopped a few feet in front of the group. He looked at them, really looked at them, and something shifted in his expression. Not anger, not hatred, something else entirely. Profound, bone-deep sadness. He turned to the younger soldiers standing behind him and said something in English, short clipped sentences that Yuki couldn't understand. Then he reached down to his belt and pulled out a ring of keys. The metal jangled as he moved forward toward the first woman in line. Keiko Nakamura, a 38-year-old nurse who had managed to maintain some dignity despite everything, stood frozen as the American sergeant approached. She braced herself for whatever was coming. A beating maybe, or worse. They had all heard the stories about what happened to women prisoners. They had been prepared for the worst. Thomas Williams knelt down in the Texas dirt. The sound of 43 women gasping was like wind through dry leaves. Akiko's eyes widened. Hana's crying stopped mid-sob. Yuki felt her breath catch in her throat. Why would an American soldier kneel before a Japanese prisoner? What kind of trap was this? Williams inserted a key into the lock on Keiko's ankle shackles. The lock was old, rusty from months of salt water and sweat. It resisted at first. He had to work at turning the key, carefully applying steady pressure. Click. The sound was small, almost insignificant. But in the silence of that Texas afternoon, it rang out like a gunshot. The metal shackles fell away from Keiko's ankles, hitting the dirt with a dull thud. The woman stood there staring down at her freed ankles as if she couldn't quite process what had just happened. The skin underneath was raw, bleeding in places, bruised purple and black where the metal had chafed for months without relief. Williams stood, moved to the next woman, knelt again, unlocked again. Another set of chains fell away. Then the next, and the next. One by one, with patient, methodical care, he worked his way down the line. When he reached Hana, the young woman flinched violently, expecting pain. Williams paused, his weathered face softening slightly. He spoke in that gentle Texas drawl, words Yuki didn't understand, but whose meaning was clear in the tone. Easy, miss. Not gonna hurt you. He worked her lock. It stuck, more stubborn than the others. Rust had nearly seized it solid. Williams tried once, the key refusing to turn. He adjusted his grip, tried again. On the third attempt, something gave way inside the old mechanism. Click. Hana's chains fell away. The girl collapsed to her knees, sobbing so hard her whole body shook. Yuki was next. She watched Williams approach, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. He knelt before her, and for the first time she saw his face up close. The lines were deeper than she'd thought. The eyes were a pale blue, startling against his sun-darkened skin. But it was the grief in those eyes that struck her. This was a man who knew loss, who carried it with him every moment of every day. Williams worked her lock. It was as stubborn as Hana's, maybe more so. The key went in, but the mechanism refused to cooperate. He muttered something in English, frustration creeping into his voice. Not frustration at her, she realized. Frustration at the lock, at the rusty metal that had caused so much pain. He tried again. The key turned halfway stuck. Williams adjusted the angle, applied more pressure. Somewhere deep in the lock, something shifted, gave way, surrendered. Click. The weight disappeared from Yuki's ankles so suddenly she actually stumbled. 6 months of constant pressure, of metal grinding against bone, of pain with every single step, and now, nothing. The absence of the chains was almost as shocking as their presence had been. Williams reached out to steady her, his hand on her elbow, keeping her from falling. The touch was brief, professional, but gentle, so impossibly gentle. Their eyes met for just a second. In that moment, Yuki saw something in the American sergeant's face that she didn't understand. Something that looked like recognition. Like he saw not an enemy, not a prisoner, but a person. A young woman the same age as someone he knew. Someone he cared about. Then the moment passed. Williams released her arm and moved to the next woman. It took 15 minutes to free all 43 of them. 15 minutes of methodical, patient work unlocking chains that had bound them for half a year. When the last lock clicked open, Williams stood and gathered all the chains into a heavy bundle. The metal clanked together, a sound that had meant imprisonment and now somehow meant something else. He faced the women, 43 Japanese prisoners, enemies of his country, people whose military had killed his countrymen, his friends, maybe even people he loved. They stood before him free of chains but still captive, waiting for whatever came next. William spoke. His Japanese was halting, heavily accented, clearly memorized phonetically. But the words were unmistakable. You are prisoners of war, but you are human beings. You are not animals. He paused, making sure they understood. In Texas, we don't treat people like animals. Not even our enemies. The words hung in the scorching Texas air like a physical presence. Several women gasped. Akiko's stone mask cracked wide open, showing naked shock underneath. Hana began to sob again, but differently now. Not the quiet tears of despair, but something louder, more desperate. Yuki felt something inside her chest shatter. A wall she had built to protect herself from whatever horror awaited. A barrier between her humanity and the dehumanization of captivity. It cracked, fractured, began to crumble. Because this unexpected kindness, this recognition of their humanity by the very people who had every right to deny it, this was more terrifying than any torture could have been. Torture would have confirmed what they'd been told. Torture would have made sense. But kindness versus humanity extended to enemies that destroyed everything they thought they knew. A young private approached Williams, speaking quickly in English. The sergeant nodded, replied briefly, then turned back to the women. He gestured towards several waiting trucks, these ones with bench seats instead of metal beds, with shade covers instead of bare canvas. Let's get you ladies somewhere cooler, he said in English, then repeated something similar in broken Japanese. The women were loaded onto the trucks. Without chains, they could actually walk normally for the first time in months. But the sensation was so alien that many of them stumbled, their bodies having forgotten what free movement felt like. Yuki kept touching her ankles, feeling the raw, chafed skin where the metal had been. The pain was still there, would be there for weeks. But the weight was gone. The trucks drove through the sprawling base, and the women pressed against the sides, stealing glimpses of this impossible place. Buildings stood intact and maintained their paint fresh, their windows whole. Grass actually grew here, kept green by sprinkler systems despite the Texas heat. Gardens bloomed with flowers. Flowers growing freely for no reason except beauty. They passed the base exchange where soldiers shopped for goods like they were at any normal store. They drove by the motor pool where rows of trucks and jeeps sat in perfect order, maintained and ready. They saw the parade ground where young soldiers drilled in formation, their movements precise and practiced. Everything spoke of organization, abundance, power. This was not a nation on the brink of collapse. This was not a people desperate and starving. This was strength. Overwhelming, undeniable strength. The truck carrying Yuki passed close to what looked like a mess hall. Through the open windows came the sound of men laughing, the clatter of dishes, the sizzle of cooking food. And that smell, that incredible, overwhelming smell of real food being prepared for people who expected to eat well, who took abundance for granted. Fumiko Ito, a 35-year-old woman who had been a school teacher before the war, spoke softly from across the truck bed. We were told America was burning, that their cities were rubble, that their people were starving, just like ours. Nobody replied. What was there to say? The evidence of the lie surrounded them on all sides. The trucks pulled up to a large whitewashed building with a red cross painted on the side, a medical facility. The women were led inside where the smell of antiseptic and soap replaced the smell of barbecue. It was clean, impossibly spotlessly clean. American nurses waited for them, women in crisp white uniforms with red crosses on their caps. They were smiling, actually smiling at Japanese prisoners. One of them, who spoke halting Japanese with an American accent, stepped forward. "Welcome," she said. The word was so incongruous, so impossible in this context that several women laughed. Bitter, disbelieving laughs, but laughs nonetheless. We are here to help you. Help. That word again. It made no sense. None of this made sense. They were taken one by one into examination rooms. Yuki's turn came quickly. A doctor waited for her, a woman in her late 30s with kind eyes and gentle hands. A female doctor. In Japan, military doctors were always men. Always, doctor. Sarah Mitchell introduced herself through a translator, though Yuki caught only fragments of the English. The examination was thorough but gentle. The doctor checked Yuki's ribs, noting the bruises with concern. Listened to her heartbeat. Examined the infected cut on her arm, where a chain had broken skin and the wound had festered. When Dr. Mitchell touched a particularly tender spot on Yuki's ribs, Yuki couldn't help but wince. The doctor immediately pulled back. "I'm sorry," she said through the translator. "I know it hurts. I'll be more careful." An apology. To a prisoner. To an enemy. The doctor cleaned the infected wound with careful attention, applying antiseptic that stung, but promised healing. She wrapped it in clean white bandages, then added antibiotic ointment. Precious medical supplies being used on a Japanese prisoner as if her health mattered. "You're very brave," Dr. Mitchell said softly as she finished the bandaging. "This must be terrifying, but you're safe now. I promise." Promise. The Japanese word was yakusoku, a sacred commitment not to be given lightly. Yuki wanted to ask why. Why be kind? Why waste resources? Why treat enemies like patients deserving care? But she had no words, not in English. And even in Japanese, she wasn't sure she could formulate the question. After the medical examinations came the showers. They were led to a large bathing facility with individual stalls, each one curtained for privacy. Privacy. That concept had ceased to exist months ago in the crowded camps and cargo holds. Now suddenly it was being offered again as if it were a basic right. Each woman was given supplies. Real soap that smelled like lavender, not the harsh lye soap they'd been allowed before. Shampoo that actually foamed with a honey fragrance that made Yuki's eyes sting with sudden tears. Thick towels, soft and clean, made from Texas cotton. And hot water. The promise of hot water. Yuki entered her stall and turned the tap, half expecting cold water, or maybe a trickle. Instead, steam began to rise almost immediately. The water ran hot. Actually, genuinely hot. She stepped under the stream and felt 40 years of memories compress into this single moment. This was the instant when everything changed. This was when the last of her defenses crumbled. The hot water hit her filthy skin and she began to cry. Not quiet tears, not dignified grief, but huge, racking sobs that came from somewhere deep in her chest, from a place she had locked away to survive. The water ran brown at her feet, washing away 6 months of dirt and sweat and fear and dehumanization. She scrubbed her skin with the lavender soap until it turned pink, until she could almost believe she was clean again. She shampooed her hair once, twice, 3 times, watching the tangles loosen and dissolve, watching months of accumulated grime disappear down the drain. Around her in other stalls, she could hear similar sounds. Women crying as they washed, women laughing with a slightly hysterical edge, women who were being reminded through something as simple as hot water and soap that they were human beings deserving of basic dignity. When Yuki finally emerged wrapped in one of those soft towels, she felt reborn. Scoured clean, not just physically, but somehow spiritually. Waiting for them were clothes. Not uniforms, not prison garb, but simple cotton dresses in various sizes. Plain but clean and whole without tears or stains. There were undergarments, thick socks, and canvas shoes that miraculously actually fit. Yuki dressed in these new clothes and caught sight of herself in a small mirror mounted on the wall. She barely recognized the woman staring back at her. The face was still hollow, the cheeks still sunken from months of malnutrition. But the skin was clean. The hair, though still damp, was free of tangles and grime. The eyes looked almost human again. Almost like the girl she had been before the war consumed everything. She turned from the mirror and saw the other women having similar moments of recognition and disbelief. Hana was laughing and crying at the same time. Akiko stood frozen, one hand touching her clean dress as if she couldn't quite believe it was real. Mariko Suzuki, a 40-year-old head nurse from Okinawa, kept staring at her reflection with an expression of profound confusion. Around them, the American nurses moved with calm efficiency, checking that everyone had what they needed, that the clothes fit, that no one was in medical distress from the shock of cleanliness after so long without. One of the nurses approached Yuki, noticing her staring at her reflection. She said something in English, the words flowing and incomprehensible. But then she smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes, and gave Yuki a gentle pat on the shoulder. The touch said what words couldn't. "You're okay now. You're safe." Yuki wanted to believe it, but 40 years later in that Tokyo classroom, she would tell her students the truth. That in that moment, standing clean and clothed in a Texas medical facility, she had been more terrified than at any point during her entire captivity. Because kindness from the enemy meant that everything she had been taught might be a lie. And if the enemy could be kind, could be human, could show mercy to people who had killed their sons and brothers and fathers, then what did that say about her own people? About the things her nation had done in the name of war? That question would haunt her for the rest of her life. But the answer, when it finally came, would change not just her understanding of the past, but her vision of what the future could be. If we chose mercy over revenge, if we chose humanity over hatred, if we chose to unlock the chains, both literal and metaphorical, that bind us to the worst versions of ourselves. But first, before understanding could come, before transformation was possible, there had to be one more shock. One more revelation that would shatter the illusions and force them to confront an unbearable truth. The first meal in America was waiting, and with it, the crushing weight of abundance in a world where their families were starving. The dining hall was nothing like the cramped, filthy spaces where they had been fed scraps in previous camps. This was a real cafeteria with long wooden tables and benches that gleamed under electric lights. Windows ran along both sides of the building, letting in the late afternoon Texas sun. The room was cool, impossibly cool, air-conditioned against the brutal heat outside. American soldiers and staff sat at other tables throughout the hall, eating their own meals, talking in normal tones. Some glanced at the Japanese women as they entered, but without malice. A few even nodded in greeting. It was all so casual, so ordinary, that it felt like stepping into a dream where the rules of war had been suspended. The women lined up nervous and uncertain. They were handed trays, actual metal trays, with divided sections, not the dented tin bowls they'd eaten from before. And then they saw the food. Yuki stopped moving, causing a small backup in the line behind her. She couldn't process what she was seeing. It had to be a mistake. This couldn't be for them. But the American woman serving a Mexican Texan in her 50s with kind eyes and graying hair smiled and gestured for Yuki to move forward. She said something in Spanish, accented English, then tried again in slow, careful words. "Take what you want, Mia. There's plenty." Plenty, that word. In 6 months, Yuki had forgotten what plenty meant. The steam rising from the serving dishes carried smells so rich, so overwhelming, that several women in line actually swayed on their feet. This wasn't just food. This was abundance made manifest. This was proof of everything the propaganda had denied. On the serving line, laid out as if it were the most normal thing in the world, was a feast. Slow-smoked brisket, the centerpiece of Texas barbecue, sat in thick slices that fell apart at the touch of the serving spoon. The meat had been cooked for 16 hours over oak wood, developing a bark so dark it was almost black, crispy and savory and glistening with rendered fat. Underneath that crust, the meat was pink and tender, every fiber separated and ready to melt on the tongue. The smoke smell alone was enough to make Yuki's knees weak. Pinto beans cooked with chunks of bacon, brown sugar, and onions until they were soft and rich. Cornbread golden and still warm with honey butter already melting on top. Grilled corn on the cob, each kernel charred, just slightly brushed with more butter and sprinkled with salt. Coleslaw creamy and tangy, made with fresh cabbage that still had some crunch to it. There was white rice, fluffy and perfect for those who wanted something familiar. There were dinner rolls soft as clouds. There was gravy thick and savory. And at the end of the line, sweating in the cool air, were pitchers of iced sweet tea, the condensation running down the glass like tears. The woman serving, Mrs. Elena Gonzalez, as Yuki would learn her name, didn't just put food on the plates. She loaded them. Generous portions that would have been scandalous even in peacetime, Japan, let alone in the starving world of 1945. Yuki held out her tray with shaking hands. Mrs. Gonzalez placed 3 thick slices of brisket on it, the meat threatening to spill over the edges of the compartment. added a huge scoop of beans, 2 pieces of cornbread, an ear of corn, a mound of coleslaw, rice, a roll. "Eat up, honey," Mrs. Gonzalez said in English, patting Yuki's hand. "You need it." Yuki carried her impossibly full tray to a table near the back where the other Japanese women were gathering. They sat close together, seeking safety in numbers even here, even in this strange place where the enemy fed them like guests instead of prisoners. For a long moment no one ate. 43 women sat staring at their plates, unable to reconcile what they were seeing with what they had been told. Unable to understand how their enemy could have this much food while Japan starved. Hana was the first to break. The 19-year-old looked down at her brisket, at the steam still rising from it, at the abundance that covered her entire tray, and she began to cry. Again. Still. Always. Tears dropped onto her rice, disappearing into the white grains. Akiko sat rigid, her face that stone mask again, but her hands gripped her fork so tightly her knuckles had gone white. She was staring at the brisket like it was an enemy she needed to defeat, but didn't know how. Yuki took a small bite of the smoked meat. She cut a piece with her fork, raised it to her mouth, placed it on her tongue. The taste exploded through her senses like a physical blow. Smoky, tender, rich with fat and seasoning, and 16 hours of patient cooking. So overwhelmingly delicious that she had to stop and just breathe, had to close her eyes and force herself not to cry like Hana, not to break down in this public space. She had forgotten. In a year of moldy bread and thin gruel and months of near starvation, she had completely forgotten what real food tasted like. Forgotten the sensation of flavors that were meant to bring guayao, not just sustain life. Forgotten what it felt like to eat something that had been prepared with abundance, with the assumption that there would be more tomorrow and the day after and the day after that. Around the table, the women began to eat, slowly at first, taking tiny bites as if the food might disappear if they moved too quickly. Then faster, the hunger of months overwhelming their caution. Then desperately stuffing food into their mouths as if they feared someone would snatch the trays away at any moment. Mariko ate her beans methodically, 1 spoonful at a time, but tears streamed down her face with each bite. Fumiko broke off a piece of cornbread, tasted the honey butter, and actually laughed. A short, sharp sound that held no humor, only disbelief. One of the older women, Sachiko, ate too quickly after months of starvation. Her stomach, shrunken from malnutrition, rebelled. She turned away from the table and vomited onto the floor. An American soldier nearby started to approach, but Mrs. Gonzalez waved him off. She came over with a mop and bucket, cleaned up the mess without a word of reproach, then brought Sachiko a glass of water and patted her shoulder. "Slower, mija," she said gently. "Your stomach needs time." Sachiko wiped her mouth, nodded, and went back to eating. More carefully this time, but still eating. Because the food was there, and it was real, and none of them knew when such abundance might appear again. Yuki bit into a peach that had been placed on her tray. Texas peaches grown in the hill country, sweet as candy and dripping with juice. The taste transported her instantly back to her childhood, to the orchard near her village where apple trees grew to autumn festivals, where her mother would make apple pies, to a world that seemed impossibly distant now. The memory was so sharp, so visceral, that it physically hurt. She thought of her mother, her 2 younger sisters, somewhere in Japan. Were they alive? Were they eating tree bark and insects like the rumors suggested? Were they even now starving, while their daughter, their sister, sat in an American cafeteria eating brisket and peaches? The guilt crashed over her like a wave, threatening to pull her under. She set down the peach, unable to take another bite. She looked around at her fellow prisoners, all of them eating in various states of emotional distress. All of them probably thinking the same thing. We are alive. We are fed. We are safe. And our families, our country suffers unimaginable horrors. The contradiction was unbearable. Fumiko, the former schoolteacher, spoke quietly from across the table. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were haunted. We were told America was burning, that their cities were in rubble, that their people were starving just like ours, that victory was inevitable because the Americans had nothing left, while we had the strength of our spirit, the protection of the emperor, the righteousness of our cause. She picked up a piece of brisket with her fork, turned it over, examining it like a puzzle she couldn't solve. But this food, these buildings, that air conditioning, this abundance, this isn't a nation on the brink of collapse. This is power beyond anything we were told existed. Nobody responded. What could they say? The evidence of the lie was literally in their mouths, on their tongues, filling their stomachs for the first time in months. They finished eating in near silence, broken only by the sounds of forks on plates and the occasional stifled sob. When they were done, when every tray had been emptied of everything it held, they sat back fuller than they had been since before the war. And with that fullness came a new kind of emptiness. The emptiness of understanding that they had been deceived, that everything they had believed about the enemy, about the war, about their own nation's chances, had been built on lies. The question was why? Why had they been lied to, and more importantly, what else had been a lie? After the meal, they were taken to their barracks. Yuki expected the worst. In the camps before, they had slept on concrete floors, packed together like cargo with no privacy and no comfort. Just cold, hard surfaces and the constant press of too many bodies in too small a space. But the building they were led to was nothing like that. It was clean. The wooden floor had been swept, the walls whitewashed. Windows lined both sides, their glass intact and clean, letting in the fading afternoon light. And running down the center of the room in two neat rows were beds, real beds, with mattresses, with pillows, with thick wool army blankets folded at the foot of each one. The women stopped in the doorway staring. Hana actually gasped. Akiko's mask slipped out again, showing naked shock. There were 43 beds, one for each woman. Not pallets on the floor, not thin mats laid side by side. Individual beds, each one with its own small footlocker at the end for personal belongings, even though none of them had anything to put in them. In one corner of the room stood a heating and cooling unit, already humming softly, keeping the temperature comfortable against the Texas heat. Electric lights hung from the ceiling, bright and steady, not the flickering candles or smoking oil lamps they'd made do with before. And at the far end of the barracks, visible through an open door, was a bathroom. Toilets that flushed, sinks with running water. The basics of civilization offered as if they were rights rather than privileges. The young American soldier who had helped them off the truck, Private James Rodriguez, stood near the door. He spoke in broken, heavily accented Japanese, clearly reading from a card he'd been given. You sleep here. You are safe. No one will hurt you. If you need something, tell the guards. We will help. Help, that impossible word again. It made Yuki's head spin. After Private Rodriguez left, the women stood in silence for a long moment. Then one by one they moved to the beds. Tentatively, as if the furniture might disappear if they moved too quickly, they sat down. The mattresses creaked softly under their weight. The springs were old military issue, but they were there. Actual springs, actual padding, actual support for bodies that had been sleeping on hard surfaces for half a year. Yuki lay back on her assigned bed, her head sinking into the pillow. It was thin, filled with something that wasn't quite soft enough to be feathers, probably cotton or some synthetic material. But it was a pillow, an actual pillow, something to cradle her head, to provide even this small comfort. She stared at the ceiling and felt her body begin to shake. Not from cold. The room was perfectly temperature controlled. From something else. From the breaking of every certainty she had held. From the shattering of her understanding of how the world worked. This was not how you treated enemies. This was not how you kept prisoners. This was not what the propaganda had promised. And if this was a lie, what else had been a lie? That night, as darkness fell outside and the lights were dimmed to a soft glow, the women whispered to each other across the room. Their voices were soft, confused, afraid. This is a trick, Akiko said from her bed near the window. They want us to trust them, to let our guard down. Then they will strike. But why remove the chains? Hana asked from somewhere in the darkness. Why feed us? Why give us beds? Maybe, Fumiko ventured carefully, maybe they actually follow their own rules. Maybe this Geneva Convention they speak of is real. Or maybe, another voice added bitter and hard, they show mercy because they have already won, because they can afford to be generous when the outcome is not in doubt. That silenced them all. Because if that was true, if America had won so completely that they could treat enemy prisoners with kindness, then what did that mean for Japan, for their families, for everything they had believed about the righteousness of their cause? Yuki pulled the wool blanket up to her chin, even though the room was warm enough not to need it. She closed her eyes, trying to will sleep to come. But her mind kept returning to the sergeant's words spoken in that halting Japanese. "You are not animals." She had heard those words and felt something fundamental shift inside her because part of her, she realized with shame and horror, had begun to believe she was less than human. The months of chains and hunger and fear had taught her that lesson had worn away at her sense of self until she had almost accepted the dehumanization as truth. And in one moment, with one simple act of unlocking shackles, that American had challenged everything, had forced her to confront the possibility that the real animals were not the prisoners, but the system that had put them in chains in the first place. But she wasn't ready to face that truth yet. Not fully. It was too big, too devastating. So she pushed it away and tried to sleep. Sleep didn't come easily. Around her in the darkness, she could hear other women struggling with the same demons. Soft crying from Hana's direction. Restless tossing from Akiko. The sound of someone praying, the words too quiet to make out, but the rhythm unmistakable. They were all trying to make sense of the impossible, trying to reconcile the enemy they had been taught to fear with the people who had given them soap and food and beds, trying to understand what it meant that Americans could be kind. Somewhere in the darkness, long after most of the others had finally fallen into exhausted sleep, Yuki heard footsteps outside. Slow, measured footsteps of someone walking the perimeter. A guard, probably, making sure they didn't escape or that no one tried to harm them. The footsteps paused outside their barracks. Through the window, Yuki could see the silhouette of a man, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a hat. Sergeant Williams, she thought. The man who had unlocked their chains. He stood there for a long moment, just watching the building. Then he took off his hat, ran a hand through his hair, in a gesture that spoke of weariness beyond measure, and walked on. Yuki wondered what he was thinking, what he was feeling. Why a man who had every reason to hate them had chosen mercy instead. She wouldn't get her answer for weeks. But when it came, it would destroy her almost as completely as the kindness had. The days took on a rhythm that was both comforting and deeply unsettling. Wake at 6 to the sound of a bugle, not the harsh shouts they had expected. Breakfast in the dining hall, eggs and bacon and toast and coffee. Real coffee, hot and strong chicory blend that tasted like luxury after months without. Then work assignments. Light work, almost insultingly light compared to what they had feared. Kitchen duty, helping Mrs. Gonzalez prepare meals and wash dishes. Laundry, folding clean clothes that smelled of soap and sunshine. Garden work, weeding and watering the vegetables that grew in neat rows behind the mess hall. No one was beaten for working slowly. No one was starved for making mistakes. The American soldiers who supervised them were professional, sometimes even kind. They showed how tasks should be done, corrected errors with patience instead of violence, and said thank you when the work was completed well. It was all wrong, all of it, and yet it continued day after day until wrong began to feel almost normal. Yuki was assigned to help Mrs. Gonzalez in the kitchen. The older woman spoke no Japanese, and Yuki's English was almost non-existent, but somehow they managed to communicate. Through gestures and demonstrations, through smiles and patience, through the universal language of food preparation. Mrs. Gonzalez taught Yuki how to make tortillas, pressing the dough flat between her palms, not too thin, or they would tear, not too thick, or they would be doughy. She showed her how to cook them on the griddle, just until they puffed and developed those characteristic brown spots. When Yuki got it right, making a perfect tortilla on her third try, Mrs. Gonzalez clapped her hands and beamed. She buttered the tortilla while it was still hot and handed it to Yuki to taste. The flavor was simple but perfect. Corn and butter and heat. Yuki bit into it and closed her eyes, savoring something that just hours ago hadn't existed, that had been created by her own hands under the gentle guidance of this enemy woman. Mrs. Gonzalez watched her eat, still smiling. Then her expression shifted, became more serious. She pulled a photograph from her apron pocket and showed it to Yuki, a young man in a Navy uniform, handsome with Mrs. Gonzalez's eyes and smile. He couldn't have been more than 25. Mi esposo, Miss Gonzalez said. Then, searching for words Yuki might understand, my husband. She pointed to the photograph, then made a gesture like an explosion, her hands flying outward. She said a date that Yuki recognized, even though it was in English. December 7th, Pearl Harbor. Yuki froze the tortilla halfway to her mouth. Mrs. Gonzalez's husband had died at Pearl Harbor, killed by Japanese forces. 4 years ago, but from the look in the older woman's eyes, it might as well have been yesterday. And here she was teaching a Japanese prisoner how to make tortillas, being kind to someone whose nation had widowed her. Yuki wanted to apologize, to say she was sorry, to somehow make up for what had been done, but she had no words. The gulf between them was too wide, the language barrier too complete. Instead, she bowed, deeply formally, the kind of bow reserved for profound respect or profound apology. She held it for a long moment, her eyes closed, trying to pour every ounce of regret and sorrow and confusion into the gesture. When she straightened, Mrs. Gonzalez was crying, but she was also smiling. She reached out and touched Yuki's shoulder, squeezed gently, and said something in Spanish. The words were incomprehensible, but the tone was clear. Forgiveness, or at least understanding that Yuki was not responsible for her husband's death any more than Mrs. Gonzalez was responsible for whatever suffering Japanese civilians were enduring. Just war, Mrs. Gonzalez said, her English heavily accented, but clear enough. War is enemy, not you, not me. War. And Yuki understood in that moment something that would take years to fully process. The enemy wasn't Japanese or American. The enemy was war itself. The enemy was a system that turned ordinary people into killers and victims. The enemy was the lie that some lives mattered less than others. She nodded, unable to speak, past the lump in her throat. Mrs. Gonzalez patted her shoulder once more, then handed her another ball of tortilla dough. Again, she said, gesturing to the griddle, practice makes perfect. So they went back to making tortillas, two women on opposite sides of a war, finding common ground in the simple act of creating food together. The work continued throughout October. The Texas heat gradually eased, though it remained warm by Japanese standards. The women learned bits of English picked up from the soldiers and staff, who treated them with casual professionalism. Some of the younger guards, like Private Rodriguez, even tried to learn Japanese phrases, their pronunciation so terrible it sometimes made the women laugh despite themselves. Rodriguez was particularly determined. Every morning he would greet them with an enthusiastic, "Ohayo gozaimasu." His attempt at "Ohayo gozaimasu" was so mangled, the syllables so tortured, that it became a running joke among the women. But he kept trying, kept practicing, kept approaching them with that eager, friendly smile. One day Yuki stumbled while carrying a heavy pot of water across the kitchen. Her foot caught on something, maybe her own exhaustion, and she went down hard. The pot crashed to the floor, water splashing everywhere. She landed on her hands and knees, pain shooting up from her right knee where it had struck the hard tile. Before she could even try to get up, Rodriguez was there. He'd been passing by the kitchen and had heard the crash. Without hesitation, he helped her to her feet, his hands gentle but firm on her arms. "You okay?" he asked in English, his face creased with genuine concern. Then, fumbling for the Japanese words he'd learned, "Daijoubu desu ka?" Yuki nodded, embarrassed more than hurt. But when she tried to put weight on her right leg, pain flared sharp and hot. She must have scraped the knee badly when she fell. Rodriguez saw her wince and immediately moved to support her weight. "Infirmary," he said firmly. "We get that checked." He helped her limp to the medical building, supporting most of her weight, talking to her in a mix of English and broken Japanese that she only half understood. But the meaning was clear in his actions. He was worried. He wanted to help. This enemy soldier, this young man who couldn't have been more than 22, cared that she had hurt herself. At the infirmary, a nurse cleaned and bandaged Yuki's knee. The scrape was superficial, nothing serious, but it was bleeding and would need care to avoid infection. Rodriguez waited the entire time, refusing to leave, even when the nurse told him he could go. When it was done, when Yuki's knee was wrapped in clean white gauze, she turned to him and asked the question that had been burning in her mind since the day they arrived. "Why?" The English word came out halting but clear. "Why kind?" Rodriguez looked surprised by the question, as if the answer was so obvious it didn't need stating. He thought for a moment, his young face serious, then gave her the simplest, most devastating answer she could have imagined. "Because you're a person. You got hurt. That's all." That's all. As if it were that simple. As if the fact that she was human was enough reason to show care and concern. As if her being Japanese, being the enemy, being a prisoner didn't matter as much as the basic recognition of her humanity. Yuki felt tears prick her eyes. She bowed to him not as deeply as she had bowed to Mrs. Gonzalez, but with real gratitude. Rodriguez looked uncomfortable, the way Americans always seem to when faced with formal Japanese courtesy. But he nodded back, that easy smile returning to his face. "No problem," he said. then murdering the Japanese once again, do itachi mashite. Despite everything, despite the confusion and the guilt, and the world turned upside down, Yuki smiled. That night, she told the others about the incident. Some dismissed it as an anomaly, a single kind guard who didn't represent the whole. But others were beginning to notice a pattern. Small kindnesses accumulated. The guard who shared his cigarettes even though regulations said he shouldn't. The cook who always gave them extra portions. The officer who approved their request for Japanese language newspapers so they could follow news from home. These moments built up layer by layer, creating a picture that contradicted everything they had been taught. Americans were supposed to be devils, monsters, subhuman creatures without honor or mercy. But the people around them were just people. Tired people, sometimes kind, sometimes not, but undeniably, confusingly, impossibly human. And then in late October, the letters began to arrive. Letters from Japan, facilitated by the Red Cross, carried across thousands of miles of ocean to reach these 43 women in the heart of Texas. Not everyone received letters. The Japanese postal system had collapsed. Communication was sporadic at best. But some women did, and what those letters contained would shatter whatever fragile peace they had begun to find. The mail call was held in the common area after dinner. An American officer read names from envelopes, handing them out one by one. Each name called brought a gasp, a rush of hope and fear. Each name not called brought crushing disappointment. Hannah's name was called. The 19-year-old girl took the envelope with shaking hands, stared at it as if it might bite her. The handwriting was her mother's, she said. Definitely her mother's. She opened it carefully, unfolding the thin paper inside. Her eyes scanned the words, and then her face crumpled. She read it aloud, her voice breaking with every sentence. Private Rodriguez translated for the American staff, but the Japanese women didn't need translation. They could hear the truth in Hannah's voice, see it in the tears that fell onto the letter, smudging the ink. My daughter, if this reaches you, know that we are glad you live. Your father is missing since Manchuria. We have not heard from him in 8 months. Your brother Kenji is sick with hunger. The doctors can do nothing. There is no medicine, no food. We have nothing. The bombs destroyed our neighborhood. Our home is gone. We live in a shelter made from wood we scavenge from the ruins. We eat tree bark when we can find it. We eat insects, anything that might have nutrition. If you are alive, if you are fed, if you can send food somehow, please, we are starving. Your loving mother. The room fell completely silent. Not a sound, not a breath. Just the terrible weight of those words hanging in the air like a death sentence. That evening for dinner, they had been served pot roast with potatoes and carrots, fresh bread with butter, green beans cooked with bacon, and for dessert, apple pie with vanilla ice cream, while Hannah's family ate insects. While Hannah's brother, a boy whose face she could barely remember after years apart, wasted away from hunger. While her mother, the woman who had given birth to her and raised her and sent her off to serve her country, dug through ruins looking for bark to eat. Another letter was opened. Mariko, the head nurse from Okinawa, read hers with a stone face that gradually cracked and crumbled as the words sank in. Her letter described the complete destruction of Okinawa, the American invasion, the desperate fighting, the Japanese military using civilians as human shields, the mass suicides ordered by officers who preferred death to surrender, the starvation, the disease, the utter complete devastation of everything she had known. And then, at the end, almost as an afterthought, the news that would change everything. The emperor has broadcast to the nation. He says the war is over, that we must endure the unendurable and accept what cannot be accepted. Japan has surrendered, unconditionally, completely. We have lost. Lost. The word hung in the air like a gunshot. Japan had surrendered. The war was over, and they had lost. Everything they had been told about inevitable victory, about American collapse, about the divine wind that would save them all lies. Everything they had believed about their nation's strength, about the righteousness of their cause, about the certainty of triumph, shattered in a single sentence. And here they sat in warm barracks with full stomachs and clean clothes while their families starved in the ruins of their surrendered homeland. The guilt was crushing, suffocating, unbearable. Yuki looked down at her hands that had gained back some weight, that no longer showed every bone beneath thin skin. She caught her reflection in a window, saw cheeks that had filled out, eyes that looked clearer and healthier than they had in months. She was alive. She was fed. She was safe. And her mother, her two younger sisters, somewhere in the ruins of Japan, were they even alive? Were they eating insects like Hana's family? Were they among the millions starving while their daughter and sister lived in enemy comfort? The contradiction was not just unbearable. It was obscene. Akiko spoke into the silence, her voice hollow and defeated. We sit in comfort while our people burn. We gain weight while our families starve. We were told we were the enemy's prisoners. But who has really imprisoned us or them? No one answered. What answer could there be? Fumiko added quietly. All those stories, all those lessons I taught my students about American barbarity, about their cruelty, about how they would destroy Japan and leave nothing but ashes. I believed it. I taught children to believe it. She looked around at the clean barracks, at the electric lights, at the evidence of care and consideration that surrounded them. But we are the ashes. Japan is the ruin. And the Americans? She couldn't finish the sentence. They didn't need her to finish it. They all understood. The Americans had won, not just militarily, but morally, had proven their superiority not through cruelty, but through mercy, had demonstrated their civilization not by destroying their enemies, but by treating them with dignity. And that truth was more devastating than any defeat in battle could ever be. The weight of those letters hung over the barracks like a physical presence. That night, sleep came in fragments, broken by quiet sobbing and restless turning. In the darkness, 43 women wrestled with guilt that had no easy resolution, grief that had no outlet, and questions that had no answers. Yuki lay in her bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of suffering around her. The soft weeping from Hana's direction had not stopped for hours. Someone else was praying the words, a constant whispered murmur that rose and fell like breathing. Akiko, who had been their rock of strength for so long, could be heard pacing by the window, her footsteps a slow rhythm of agitation. The barracks had become a prison after all, not one with chains and locked doors, but something worse, a prison of conscience, of knowing that their survival came at a cost they hadn't chosen to pay, that their health, their safety, their full stomachs existed in obscene contrast to the suffering of those they loved. As the first gray light of dawn crept through the windows, Yuki made a decision. She couldn't live with the not knowing anymore, couldn't carry the weight of American kindness without understanding its source. The Sergeant Williams, the man who had unlocked their chains, who supervised their care with such meticulous attention, who sometimes stood outside their barracks at night as if keeping vigil over them. She needed to know why. Why show mercy to enemies? Why follow rules when Japan had not? Why treat them like human beings when it would have been so much easier, so much more understandable to treat them like the animals the propaganda had promised they would become? She needed to ask, and she needed to be prepared for whatever answer came. Over the next 2 weeks, as November arrived and the Texas heat finally began to ease into something approaching autumn, Yuki threw herself into learning English. The base offered classes twice a week taught by a volunteer named Miss Sarah Thompson, a young woman in her 30s with infinite patience and a gift for making complex grammar simple. Yuki attended every session, sat in the front row, absorbed every word. She practiced during her work hours in the kitchen, asking Mrs. Gonzalez for the English names of ingredients, utensils, cooking techniques. She listened to the American soldiers talking, picking out words she recognized, building her vocabulary one phrase at a time. Basic sentences at first. Good morning. Thank you. Please help me. May I ask you something? I am sorry, I do not understand. Then more complex structures, questions, observations, the ability to express not just needs but thoughts, feelings, the complex internal landscape that couldn't be reduced to simple gestures. Private Rodriguez became an unlikely ally in this effort. He continued his own mangling of Japanese, but he also patiently corrected Yuki's English repeating words until her pronunciation improved, acting out meanings when her vocabulary failed. One afternoon in mid-November, while Yuki was helping carry supplies from the truck to the kitchen, Rodriguez struck up a conversation. His face was more serious than usual, lacking that easy smile she had come to expect. Yuki, he said carefully, can I ask you something? It's about Sergeant Williams. She paused, a box of canned goods in her arms. Yes. You ever notice how he looks at you, at all of you, I mean, but especially the younger ones? You and Hannah and the others around that age. Yuki nodded slowly. She had noticed. The way William's expression would shift when he saw them, something painful crossing his weathered face before he could lock it away. Rodriguez glanced around, making sure they were alone. Then he spoke quietly, his words careful. Sergeant lost his son, David. He was a Marine, died at Iwo Jima 6 months ago, March 26th. Japanese sniper got him on the third day of the battle. The box nearly slipped from Yuki's hands. She caught it at the last second, set it down on the ground before she could drop it. Her English wasn't good enough to express what she was feeling, so she said the only thing she could manage. His son, we killed his son. Rodriguez winced but nodded. War killed his son. But yeah, Japanese forces were defending Iwo Jima. David was 19 years old when he died. Just a kid, really. 19, younger than Yuki, the same age as Hana. And he's still, Yuki struggled for the words in English, finally found them. He's still kind to us, to Japanese prisoners. That's why I'm telling you this, Rodriguez said, because I see you watching him sometimes. See you trying to figure him out. And I thought you should know what it costs him. Every day managing this camp, making sure you're all treated right. Every time he looks at you girls, he sees the age his boy was. Sees what David could have been if he'd lived. He picked up his own box of supplies, preparing to head back to the truck. Sergeant Williams is the best man I know, he added, but he's carrying a weight that would crush most people. Just thought you should understand that. Rodriguez walked away, leaving Yuki standing in the November sunlight, her mind reeling. Williams had lost his son to Japanese forces, his only child from what Rodriguez had said. And 6 months later, he had been assigned to manage a camp full of Japanese women prisoners. Women the same age as the boy he had lost. It should have filled him with rage, should have made him cruel, vengeful, eager to make them suffer as he had suffered. That would have been human, understandable, maybe even justified. But instead, he had knelt in the Texas dust and unlocked their chains, had spoken those 5 words that shattered worlds. You are not animals. Had ensured they were fed, clothed, housed, treated with dignity and care. Why? What kind of man did that? What kind of strength? What kind of character? What kind of principle could drive someone to show mercy to the people who had killed their child? Yuki needed to know. The question burned inside her, demanding an answer. That night, she told Akiko what she had learned. The older woman listened in silence, her face unreadable in the dim light of the barracks. So he lost everything to us, Akiko said finally, and still chose kindness. I'm going to ask him tomorrow, Yuki said. I need to understand why. Akiko studied her for a long moment. Are you prepared for the answer? Sometimes the truth is harder to bear than ignorance. I don't care. I need to know. The next day, Yuki watched William's movements, learning his routine. Every evening, just after dinner, he walked the perimeter of the compound. A solitary patrol, just him and his thoughts, checking the fences and the buildings with the methodical care of a man who took his responsibilities seriously. When evening came, Yuki waited until she saw him begin his walk. Then, gathering her courage, she followed at a distance. Her English was better now, good enough to communicate basic ideas. It would have to be enough. She found him near the eastern fence line, standing with his hands in his pockets, looking out at the Texas landscape. As the sun set, the sky was ablaze with orange and purple, the kind of sunset that only happened in places with flat horizons and endless sky. He must have heard her approach because he turned before she spoke. For a moment, something flashed across his face, not anger, something softer, something that looked almost like recognition. Yuki, he said, not a question. He knew her name, knew all their names. Everything okay? Yes, sir. She replied, the English words careful but clear. May I speak with you? William studied her for a moment, then nodded. Of course, what's on your mind? She had practiced this, rehearsed the words in her head 100 times. But now, standing before him, they all fled. She had to start simple, build up to the impossible question. I learned, she began slowly, from Private Rodriguez, about your son, David. William's entire body went rigid, his jaw clenched. For a second, she thought he might tell her to leave, to mind her own business, to go back to the barracks. But then his shoulders sagged slightly, and he nodded. Yeah, David. He died at Iwo Jima. I am so sorry. The words felt inadequate, childish. How do you apologize for a war, for a death, for the collective sin of an entire nation? Wasn't your fault, William said quietly. You're a nurse. You were trying to save lives, not take them. But Japanese forces, they kill your son. Yes. Silence stretched between them. The sunset painted the sky in colors too beautiful for the conversation they were having. In the distance, a bird called out, its voice lonely in the growing dusk. Yuki forced herself to ask the question. In halting English mixing in Japanese words when her vocabulary failed, she asked what she had come to ask. Why you kind we enemy? Our people did terrible things, you know? You lose son because of us. Why you still human to us? Williams looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out something that glinted in the fading light. Dog tags, military identification tags worn and scratched from years of use. He held them in his palm, his thumb rubbing over the embossed letters. You want the truth, Yuki? Please. Williams took a deep breath, choosing his words with care. When you all arrived, when I unlocked those chains, you know what I thought. I thought her countrymen killed my boy. You're 20 years old. David was 19 when he died. I looked at you and I thought, I could make her suffer, make them all suffer. No one would stop me. No one would blame me. Yuki felt ice run through her veins. She had been right to be afraid of the answer. But Williams wasn't finished. But then I remembered something David made me promise before he shipped out. His voice grew thick, weighted with grief that time had not eased. He was 16 when Pearl Harbor happened. Wanted to enlist right away, get revenge for what your country did. I made him wait until he was old enough, told him to do it right, not rush into it angry. William stared at the dog tags in his hand. Before he left for the Pacific, we were out at the ranch working cattle like we'd done since he was a boy. And he turned to me and said, Dad, promise me something. Don't become what we're fighting against. Don't let hate win. Promise me. He looked up, meeting Yuki's eyes directly. I didn't really understand what he meant then. Thought it was just idealism, the kind of thing young people say before they've seen real war. But now I think he knew something I didn't. He knew that the real battle isn't on some island in the Pacific. It's right here. Williams touched his chest over his heart. The real battle is choosing who we want to be. Choosing whether we're going to be people of principle or people of revenge. He held out the dog tags, showing them to Yuki. In the dying light, she could just make out the embossed information. David Williams, USMC, born June 15, 1925, died March 26, 1945. Williams' voice was steady, but his hands trembled slightly. My son died believing in something. He believed America should be better than its enemies, that we should hold to our principles even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. He paused, gathering himself. What your leaders did, what your soldiers did, that wasn't you. You're a nurse. You tried to heal people. You're not responsible for every evil thing done in your country's name. But even if you were, he continued, his voice growing stronger, even if you'd done terrible things yourself, we still have rules. The Geneva Convention, basic human rights, international law. We follow these rules not because the enemy deserves it. We follow them because we do, because that's who we choose to be. Williams closed his fingers around the dog tags. My boy died fighting your countrymen. I have every reason to hate you, every right to make you suffer, every justification anyone could ask for. He opened his hand again, looked down at the tags. But David made me promise to stay human, to not become what we're fighting. So I'm keeping that promise. I'm treating you the way I'd want my son treated if he'd been captured, with dignity, with basic human decency, with the recognition that even enemies are people. Before Yuki could respond, Williams did something that would echo through the rest of her life. He took those dog tags, his last physical connection to his dead son, and placed them in her palm. Closed her fingers around them. I want you to have these, he said. No. Yuki tried to pull her hand away. Cannot. Your son is all you have. Memory of him. Williams kept his hand closed over hers, keeping the tags in her palm. That's where you are wrong. This isn't all I have. I've got memories of fishing with David, teaching him to ride, watching him grow into a good man. I've got his letters. I've got his mother's love for him. I've got 14 years of being his father. He released her hand, but the tags remained. What I'm giving you isn't my last memory of David. It's my promise to him. My promise that mercy matters more than revenge, that humanity matters more than hatred. When you go back to Japan, Williams continued, I want you to take these with you. I want you to remember that an American whose son was killed by Japanese forces chose kindness over cruelty. I want you to tell people about David, about what he believed in. I want you to help build a world where young men like him don't have to die on beaches fighting other young men who should have been their friends. Tears streamed down Yuki's face. She bowed deeply, the Japanese bow of profound respect and gratitude. When she straightened, she could barely speak. I promise, she managed in English. I promise I tell them about David, about you, about mercy, about choose humanity over hate. I promise, Brahman. Williams nodded, his own eyes suspiciously bright. That's all I ask. They stood together in the gathering darkness, Japanese prisoner and American jailer, connected by grief and understanding and the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, something good could come from all this suffering. After a long moment, Williams spoke again. You got family back in Japan, Yuki. Hi. Yes, mother, 2 sisters. Not know if alive. Then you get home to them. You survive this. You tell them what you learned here. You help build something better than what came before. His voice was firm, commanding. That's how we honor the dead, both yours and mine. We make sure their deaths meant something. We make sure the world they left behind becomes worth the price they paid. Yuki nodded, unable to trust her voice. She clutched the dog tags, feeling their weight, their warmth from William's hand, their impossible significance. Thank you, she whispered. Then in Japanese, because some things could only be said in one's native language, arigatou gozaimasu. Hontou ni arigatou gozaimasu. Williams didn't understand the Japanese, but he understood the sentiment. He nodded once more, then turned and continued his patrol, leaving Yuki standing in the darkness, holding the dog tags of a young Marine she had never met, but would remember for the rest of her life. That night, Yuki wrote in the notebook Mrs. Gonzalez had given her. Her hands shook as she formed the Japanese characters. Today I understood something that will change my life forever. Sergeant Williams lost his only son to Japanese forces. David was 19 years old when he died, younger than me, and still Williams chose mercy over revenge. Not because we deserved it, because he chose who he wanted to be. This is real strength, this is real honor. Not dying for the emperor, not blind obedience to authority, but choosing humanity over hatred, choosing principles over pain, choosing to see people as people, even when they're supposed to be enemies. When I return to Japan, I will tell this story. I will tell about David Williams, who died believing in mercy. I will tell about Thomas Williams, who honored his son through kindness to enemies. I will tell about American principles defeating us more completely than American bombs ever could. This is my mission now, not war, not revenge, truth, and building something better from the ruins. She showed the dog tags to Akiko, explained what had happened. The older woman held them reverently, reading the engraved name with tears in her eyes. He gave you his son's tags. Akiko's voice was barely a whisper, his only physical remembrance. He said his son's memory lives in the choice to be merciful, not in metal, in actions. Akiko sat down heavily on her bed. Then I have been wrong about everything, about strength, about honor, about what civilization means. Around them, other women had gathered listening. Word spread through the barracks about what had happened, about the dog tags, about Williams's choice, about the promise Yuki had made. Fumiko, the former teacher, spoke into the stunned silence. This is what we must take back to Japan. Not just the story of our captivity, not just the tale of American abundance, but this, the story of a man who lost everything and chose mercy anyway. The story of principles held even when they cost everything. But their education in uncomfortable truths was not yet complete. One more revelation awaited, one more shattering of illusions. And it would come not from personal interaction, but from the cold, documented evidence of what Japan had done in the name of war. It arrived on a gray February morning, ordinary in every way except for what it would reveal. The women were in the dining hall for breakfast eating eggs and bacon as they had almost every morning for 5 months now. The routine had become comfortable, almost normal. Conversations happened in mixed Japanese and English. Laughter sometimes broke out. The initial terror had faded into cautious acceptance. The radio in the corner played music as it usually did. Soft instrumental pieces, popular songs from the American charts. Background noise that most people didn't really listen to. Then the music stopped. A news announcer came on, his voice serious and formal. And what he began to describe would shatter the last comfortable illusions any of them still held. The Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal. Evidence being presented, testimony from survivors, documentation of atrocities that Japan had committed throughout Asia and the Pacific. One of the bilingual staff members, a Japanese-American woman who had been helping with translations, stood up and began relaying the broadcast to the room. Her voice was steady, at first professional, but as the details mounted, as the scope of what was being revealed became clear, her voice began to shake. The rape of Nanking, more than 200,000 Chinese civilians murdered. Systematic rape used as a weapon of war. Entire neighborhoods burned with families trapped inside. The Bataan Death March. Tens of thousands of American and Filipino prisoners of war forced to march in brutal heat without food or water. Those who fell were bayoneted. Those who begged for mercy were beaten. 10,000 dead in a matter of weeks. Unit 731. Medical experiments conducted on living human beings. Vivisection without anesthesia. Biological weapons tested on prisoners. Men, women, children subjected to tortures that had no purpose except to gather data. The Manila Massacre. 100,000 Filipino civilians killed in the last 2 weeks of the Battle of Manila. Wholesale slaughter of innocents, including infants and elderly, by Japanese forces refusing to surrender. Comfort women. Hundreds of thousands of women and girls from Korea, China, the Philippines, forced into sexual slavery for Japanese soldiers. Raped repeatedly, brutalized, treated as less than human, then often killed when they were no longer useful. Prison camps across Asia where Allied prisoners of war were starved, tortured, worked to death. A 40% death rate compared to less than 1% for Axis prisoners in Allied hands. Deliberate cruelty enshrined in policy. The numbers were staggering, the cruelty incomprehensible, and it had all been done in Japan's name, in their name, in the name of the emperor they had been taught to revere as divine, in the name of Asian liberation, in the name of the Greater East Asia prosperity sphere. All lies, all propaganda covering atrocities that rivaled anything in human history. The dining hall fell completely silent. Not the silence of attention, but the silence of shock, of people confronting a truth too large and too terrible to process. Yuki set down her fork, unable to eat another bite. Around her, other women were having similar reactions. Hannah was crying again, but differently now. Not tears of homesickness or fear, but tears of horror and shame. Akiko, who had clung to her dignity and her pride for so long, who had resisted accepting the full implications of American kindness, let out a sound like a wounded animal. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs that came from someplace deep and broken. Fumiko stared at her hands as if seeing blood on them. "I taught children," she whispered. "I told them we were bringing civilization to Asia, that we were liberating the Chinese and Koreans and Filipinos from Western imperialism. I believed it. I taught children to believe it." Mariko spoke, her voice hollow. "I treated wounded soldiers, heard them tell stories, heard them laugh about things they'd done to Chinese women, to captured prisoners. I thought..." She couldn't finish. What could she say? That she'd thought they were exaggerating, that soldier talk was always crude, that she'd convinced herself it couldn't be as bad as they made it sound. She had known. On some level they had all known, but knowing abstractly and hearing it documented, testified to, proved beyond any doubt, those were two different things. Yuki looked around at the American soldiers in the dining hall. Young men and women going about their day, eating breakfast, preparing for duty, living their lives. They knew. They had always known. They knew what Japanese forces had done. Knew about Bataan, about Manila, about Nanking, about all of it. They knew that the prisoners they were tasked with guarding came from a nation that had committed atrocities that defied comprehension. And still they had treated them with dignity, still followed the Geneva Convention, still provided food and shelter and medical care, still recognized their humanity even when Japan had failed to recognize the humanity of anyone else. That was the most devastating realization. Not just that Japan had done terrible things, but that America, knowing this, had still chosen mercy, had still chosen to be better than its enemy, had still chosen principles over revenge. Williams had unlocked their chains, knowing what Japanese forces had done to American prisoners. Mrs. Gonzalez had taught Yuki to make tortillas, knowing what had happened at Pearl Harbor. Dr. Mitchell had treated their wounds, knowing about the medical experiments of Unit 731. Private Rodriguez had helped Yuki when she fell, knowing about the Bataan Death March. They had all chosen mercy, all of them. Not because Japanese prisoners deserved it, but because American principles demanded it. Yuki stood up her chair, scraping loudly in the silent hall. She walked outside, needing air, needing space to process what she had just learned. She walked to the fence line, to the same spot where she had talked with Williams. She looked out at the Texas landscape, at the peaceful afternoon, at the normalcy that surrounded this place of transformation. Williams appeared beside her as if summoned by her need. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, giving her space to think, to feel, to grapple with the impossible. Finally, Yuki spoke, in English, because this truth needed to be said in the language of the people who had taught it to her. You knew, all of you knew what we did, what Japan did, and you still, she gestured helplessly at the camp, at everything it represented. Yeah, Williams said quietly, we knew. Why? The question was raw, desperate. Why be human to us when we were not human to others? Williams was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his words came slowly, carefully chosen. Because if we become what we're fighting, then what's the point of fighting? If we sink to the level of the worst our enemies have done, then we've already lost the only war that really matters. He turned to look at her directly. You're not responsible for what Imperial Japan did, Yuki. You didn't make those choices. You didn't give those orders. You were a nurse trying to save lives. And even if you had been responsible, even if you personally had committed crimes, we still have laws. We still have principles. We still have standards of human decency that we're supposed to follow. But it's hard, Yuki said, so hard to show mercy to people who showed none. The hardest thing in the world, Williams agreed. That's why it matters. That's why it's the definition of civilization. Not the easy things, the hard ones. The choices that cost us something but make us better for making them. Yuki clutched the dog tags around her neck, hidden beneath her dress. David's tags, the promise made by a young Marine and kept by his grieving father. I will tell them, she said. When I go home, I will tell them all of it. What Japan did, what America chose to do. I will tell the truth no matter how much it hurts. That's all anyone can ask, Williams said. That's how we heal, not by forgetting, not by making excuses, but by facing the truth and building something better from it. They stood together in the fading February light, prisoner and guard, enemy and friend, connected by the hardest kind of understanding. The kind that required facing ugly truths and choosing hope anyway. The kind that demanded they be better than their worst impulses. The kind that would echo through generations if they were brave enough to honor it. And somewhere in the gathering dusk, the chains that had once bound 43 women to hatred and lies continued their transformation, continued becoming something else, something that looked like the first fragile foundations of peace. 3 days after their conversation by the fence, Williams appeared at the barracks during evening hours. The women looked up surprised. He rarely came after dinner and never inside their quarters. He stood in the doorway, hat in hand, looking uncomfortable in a way they had never seen before. When he spoke, his voice was rough, as if the words cost him something to say. Ladies, I want to ask you something. It's okay to say no. Private Rodriguez stood behind him, ready to translate, but Yuki stepped forward. Her English was good enough now for this. What is it, Sergeant? Williams turned his hat in his hands, a nervous gesture that seemed out of place on this confident man. My wife Rebecca and I were having a memorial service for David next Sunday before you all ship out for repatriation. We'd like you to come, all of you, if you want. The barracks fell silent. Hana's hand flew to her mouth. Akiko stood up slowly from her bed, disbelief written across her face. Yuki found her voice first. Sir, we are Japanese. Your son died fighting us. I know, Williams met her eyes. But David believed in reconciliation, believed that after war ends, we have to find a way to be human again, to see each other as people, not just enemies. He paused, gathering himself. Rebecca lost her first husband at Pearl Harbor. She's got every reason to hate Japanese people. But she wants to do this, wants to honor David by choosing forgiveness over bitterness. We do not deserve this, Yuki said quietly. William's expression softened. None of us deserve mercy, Yuki. That's what makes it mercy. Sunday came bright and clear, one of those perfect Texas March days, where the sky stretched blue and endless. The 43 women dressed in their simple cotton dresses, the best they had. Some had tried to press the fabric smooth with their hands. Others had borrowed ribbon from the American nurses to tie back their hair. They walked to the base chapel in a quiet group, nervous and uncertain. What were they supposed to do at the memorial for a young man their nation had killed? How were they supposed to behave in the presence of his grieving parents? The chapel was small, whitewashed with a simple wooden cross at the front. American soldiers and officers filled most of the pews. They turned as the Japanese women entered, and for a moment Yuki feared she would see hatred in their eyes. But most faces showed only curiosity. Some showed something that looked like respect. A few soldiers nodded in greeting. Near the front sat a woman Yuki recognized immediately, though they had never met. Rebecca Williams, mid-40s with graying brown hair pulled back in a neat bun. Her face showed the kind of beauty that comes from strength weathered by sorrow. She wore a simple black dress and held a handkerchief in her hands, though her eyes were dry. When Rebecca saw the Japanese women, something crossed her face. Not anger, not hatred, recognition. The recognition of shared grief of loss that transcends nationality and politics and all the lies that start wars. The women sat together in the back pews trying to make themselves small, invisible. But Chaplain O'Brien, the Catholic priest who served the base, gestured for them to move forward. There was room near the front. They were guests, not intruders. Reluctantly, they moved up, settling into pews just behind the American service members. Yuki found herself only 3 rows behind Rebecca Williams. The service began simply. Chaplain O'Brien spoke about David in the way of men who had never met the deceased but understood the shape of young lives cut short. He talked about service, about sacrifice, about the hope that such deaths might mean something beyond the terrible arithmetic of war. Then Rebecca stood. She walked to the front of the chapel, moving with the careful dignity of someone who had cried all the tears she had and now faced the world with whatever strength remained. She pulled a photograph from her pocket. David in his marine dress blues, young and handsome and alive. She held it up so everyone could see. "This is my son," she began, her voice steady but soft. "David Thomas Williams, born June 15, 1925, died March 26, 1945, on the 3rd day of the Battle of Iwo Jima. He was 19 years old." She paused, looking at the photograph. "When David enlisted, I was angry. Angry at the Japanese for Pearl Harbor, angry at the war for taking my first husband, angry that my boy wanted to go fight when I'd already lost so much." Rebecca set the photo on a small table at the front next to a folded American flag and David's Purple Heart. But David wasn't angry. He was sad. Sad that the world had come to this. Sad that young men had to die for the mistakes of old men. Sad that hate had become so easy and forgiveness so hard. She turned to face the congregation directly. "Before he left, David wrote me a letter. I'd like to read part of it." Rebecca unfolded a piece of paper worn soft from being read many times. Her voice wavered slightly as she read. "Mom, I know you're scared. I'm scared too. But I need you to promise me something. When this is over, whether I come home or not, don't let this war make you bitter. Don't let my death, if I die, create more death. The Japanese soldiers I might fight, they're somebody's sons too, somebody's brothers. Maybe if we can remember that, maybe if we can see each other as people instead of enemies, maybe this will be the last war. Promise me you'll try, Mom. Promise me you'll forgive." Rebecca folded the letter carefully, placed it next to the photograph. When she looked up, tears streamed down her face, but her voice remained clear. "I'm trying to keep that promise. It's the hardest thing I've ever done." She looked directly at the Japanese women now holding their gaze. "You're not my son's killers. You're nurses who tried to save lives. Your daughters and sisters and mothers just like me. War took my David. War took your homes. We're all victims of the same evil. She picked up David's photograph again, showed it to them. This is who I lost. Remember him? Not as the enemy, but as someone who believed in mercy, someone who wanted his death to mean something more than just more hatred. Rebecca's voice broke for the first time. Someone who would want me to do what I'm doing now, seeing your humanity, choosing forgiveness over revenge, trying to build something better from all this suffering. The chapel was silent except for the sound of crying, not just from the Japanese women, though they wept openly, but from the American soldiers too. Young men who had fought, who had lost friends, who carried their own grief and guilt. Yuki stood up. She didn't plan it, didn't think about it. She simply stood, David's dog tags hanging beneath her dress, and walked forward. Rodriguez started to intercept her, but Williams raised a hand. Let her go. Yuki stopped in front of Rebecca. For a moment, they just looked at each other. Two women divided by everything except the one thing that mattered. Loss. Love. The desperate hope that maybe something good could come from so much pain. Yuki bowed, deeply, profoundly, holding nothing back. When she straightened, she pulled the dog tags from beneath her dress, held them in her palm. Her English came halting but clear. Mrs. Williams, your husband, Sergeant William, he give me these. Your son's tags. He say I should remember. Should tell people in Japan about David. About mercy. About choose humanity over hate. Yuki's voice shook, but she continued. I make promise. I promise I tell everyone. I teach Japanese children about American boy who die believing forgiveness better than revenge. I teach them about father who honor son through kindness to enemy. I teach them about mother who choose mercy when hate would be easier. She held out the dog tags, offering them back. I am sorry, so sorry. Cannot bring back your son. Cannot change what Japan did. But I promise, I make his death mean something. I help build world he wanted. World where enemies can become friends. Where mercy is stronger than victory. Rebecca looked at the gang tags in Yuki's palm. Then slowly she reached out and closed Yuki's fingers back around them. You keep those, Rebecca said softly. Tom was right to give them to you. David would want you to have them. Would want them to be a bridge instead of a barrier. Then Rebecca did something that would be remembered by everyone in that chapel for the rest of their lives. She stepped forward and embraced Yuki, pulled this young Japanese woman, this enemy prisoner, into her arms and held her while they both cried. We've all lost too much, Rebecca whispered. Let's not lose our humanity too. Yuki clung to her, sobbing. Around the chapel, the sound of weeping grew louder. Hana was crying so hard her whole body shook. Akiko stoic. Akiko, who had held herself together through everything, buried her face in her hands and wept like a child. American soldiers cried openly. Chaplain O'Brien wiped his eyes. Even William, standing at the back, had tears streaming down his weathered face. This was David's legacy. Not death on a beach, not just another casualty statistic, but this, enemies seeing each other's humanity, choosing mercy when revenge would be so much easier, building bridges out of the rubble of war. When the service ended, when the last hymn had been sung, and the last prayer said, the Japanese women filed out into the Texas sunshine. They stood in small groups, not speaking, just feeling the weight of what had happened. Mrs. Gonzalez appeared with food. She had prepared it herself, a spread of Mexican and American dishes. You can't have a proper memorial without food for after, she said firmly. David would want everyone to eat together. So they did. Japanese prisoners and American service members sharing a meal in the shadow of loss and in the light of an uncertain hope. The conversations were stilted at first, hampered by language and the strangeness of the situation. But gradually walls began to crumble. Rodriguez taught Hana to say, God bless David, in English. She practiced it over and over, getting the pronunciation right, then said it to Rebecca with such earnest sincerity that the older woman hugged her. Fumiko spoke with an American soldier who had fought at Iwo Jima, who had been there when David died. They didn't talk about the battle. They talked about wanting the war to be over, about missing home, about hoping this would be the last time the world tore itself apart. Akiko approached Williams. She bowed formally, then spoke in halting English. You are a good man. Your son was good, man. I was wrong. About Americans, about honor, about everything. Thank you for teaching me." Williams nodded, his throat too tight to speak. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the base, the gathering slowly dispersed. But something had shifted, something fundamental and irreversible. They had looked across the divide of war and seen not enemies, but people. Broken people, grieving people, but people nonetheless. That night, Yuki wrote in her notebook, "Today I attended the memorial service for David Williams. His mother, Rebecca, embraced me. She lost her first husband at Pearl Harbor and her son to Japanese forces, and she chose to embrace the enemy instead of hating us. This is what real strength looks like. Not the strength to kill, but the strength to forgive. Not the strength to hold grudges, but the strength to let them go. Not the strength to win wars, but the strength to build peace. I understand now what I must do when I return to Japan. Not just teach about the war, not just tell about American kindness, but show through my own life that mercy is possible, that forgiveness is possible, that we can choose to be better than our worst moments." This is David's legacy. This is what his 19 years of life and his death on that beach must mean. Not just another casualty, but a bridge, a chance, a hope. I will carry that hope back to Japan, and I will spend the rest of my life making sure it spreads. The announcement came in early May, posted on a bulletin board outside the dining hall. Repatriation ships would begin departing in June. The 43 women would be among the first groups to return to Japan. The news should have brought joy. Instead, it brought a complex tangle of emotions no one could quite name. Relief at the thought of going home. Fear of what home had become. Guilt about leaving the safety and abundance of captivity. Anxiety about facing families who had suffered while they had been fed and sheltered. "I don't want to go back," Hana admitted one evening, her voice small and scared. "Is that terrible, to not want to go home?" "It's not terrible," Fumiko said gently. "It's honest. We're going back to a country that no longer exists, to families who might not recognize who we've become." Akiko, who had changed so much from the stern woman who first arrived, spoke with quiet certainty. "We have to go back, not because it will be easy, but because we have a mission. We have a truth to tell, and if we don't tell it, who will?" The final weeks passed in a blur. The women said goodbye to the people who had become impossibly something like friends. Mrs. Gonzalez cried as she hugged each of them, pressing small gifts into their hands. Packets of cornmeal. Recipes written in Spanish they couldn't read but would treasure anyway. A photograph of herself and Yuki making tortillas together. "You tell them in Japan," Mrs. Gonzalez said through her tears, "you tell them that we can forgive, that we can move forward, that hate doesn't have to win." Dr. Mitchell gave them medical supplies to take back. Precious antibiotics, bandages, vitamins. "For your families," she said simply. Rodriguez practiced his Japanese one last time, his pronunciation still terrible but his heart pure. "Sayonara," he said to Hana, who had become his special friend. "You be safe, you be happy. You remember Americans are not devils." Hana threw her arms around him and sobbed. "I will remember. I will tell everyone. You are good person, good American." Williams came to see them off the morning they left. He stood apart from the crowd, just watching, as they loaded onto the trucks that would take them to the ship. When Yuki looked back, she saw him standing in the Texas sun, one hand raised in farewell. She touched the dog tags beneath her dress, carried his son's memory against her heart, carried the promise she had made. The voyage across the Pacific took 3 weeks. The conditions were nothing like the trip to America. They had proper quarters, regular meals, freedom to move about the ship. But the closer they got to Japan, the heavier the dread became. They stood on deck as the ship entered Tokyo Bay in mid-June 1946. What they saw stole their breath and broke whatever fragile hope they had carried. Devastation. Complete and utter devastation. The great city was gone. In its place, endless fields of rubble stretched as far as the eye could see. Makeshift shacks dotted the ruins like scabs on a wound. Smoke still rose from some areas, though the bombing had ended months ago. People moved through the destruction like ghosts, thin and ragged and hollow-eyed. This was what they were returning to. This wasteland. This graveyard of everything they had known. The ship docked, the gangway lowered. 43 women who had left Japan as prisoners of a dying empire now returned as witnesses to its death. The dock was crowded with people searching for loved ones, desperate faces scanning the disembarking passengers, some holding photographs of missing family members. Others just hoping, praying, begging for anyone who might have news. Yuki scanned the crowd, her heart pounding. There, in the back, a woman so thin she was barely recognizable. But Yuki knew that face. Even starved, even aged beyond her years, even dressed in rags. She knew. Mother, she ran, forgot dignity, forgot the crowd, forgot everything except the need to reach that skeletal figure. Her mother turned at the sound of her voice, and for a moment confusion crossed her face. Then recognition. Then joy so profound it seemed impossible for such a broken body to contain it. Yuki, my Yuki, you're alive. They collided. Yuki felt her mother's bones through the rags she wore, felt how light she was, how fragile, how close to death she had come, felt the months of starvation in every sharp angle, every hollow space. You're alive, her mother whispered again and again. That's all that matters. You're alive. But it wasn't all that mattered. That night in the tiny shelter, her family now called home, constructed from salvaged wood and corrugated metal, Yuki tried to explain, tried to tell her mother where she had been, what she had experienced. Her mother listened with a face carved from stone. When Yuki finished, when the impossible story of American kindness had been told, her mother was quiet for a long time. They were kind to you, she finally asked. Yes. Why? Yuki pulled out the dog tags, showed them to her mother in the dim light of a single candle. This was David Williams, American Marine, 19 years old, kills at Iwo Jima by Japanese forces. His father was my jailer. His father chose mercy over revenge because David made him promise to stay human. Her mother held the tags reverently, reading the engraved name with tears in her eyes. Your father believed the propaganda, she said softly. Died for lies in Manchuria. I'm glad you survived. I'm glad you learned the truth, even though it hurts. She pulled Yuki close, this daughter who looked so healthy compared to her starving family. Now you have a mission. You honor this David. You honor his father. You make their choice mean something. You help us rebuild on truth instead of more lies. And Yuki did. Over the next months and years, as Japan slowly clawed its way back from destruction, Yuki became a voice for uncomfortable truths. She found work at a makeshift clinic established by American occupation forces. Her English, her nursing skills, her unique perspective made her valuable. But more than that, she began to teach. At first informally, talking to patients at the clinic, telling them about her time in America, about the sergeant who unlocked chains, about the cook who lost her husband but still showed kindness, about the young Marine whose belief in mercy outlived him. Some people called her a traitor, spat at her feet, accused her of being brainwashed by the enemy. But others listened, especially the young people, the ones who had survived the war and wanted to build something better from the ruins. They crowded around her, asking questions, demanding to know how Japan had gone so wrong and how they could make sure it never happened again. By 1950, Yuki had become a teacher, English and American history at a rebuilt Tokyo high school. She told her students things no textbook would say, about Japanese war crimes, about American mercy, about the Geneva Convention and human rights and the principles that separated civilization from barbarism. She kept in touch with the other women from the camp. They scattered across Japan, but they carried the same mission, the same truth. Akiko, true to her word, became a peace activist, founded an organization dedicated to reconciliation and education, traveled to schools across Japan telling her story, showing the scars on her ankles where chains had been explaining what American mercy had taught her about real strength. Hana became a social worker, helping war orphans. Fumiko wrote new textbooks that told hard truths. Mariko worked with the United Nations documenting war crimes and establishing international law. All of them trying to make their experience mean something. All of them trying to honor David Williams by building the world he had wanted. In 1975, Yuki received a letter. The handwriting was shaky, but the return address made her heart stop. San Antonio, Texas, Rebecca Williams had written. Tom had died the previous year, peaceful in his sleep. His last words had been, I kept my promise to David. Rebecca was inviting Yuki to visit, to Bufayim, to see what had been built from all that pain. Yuki went, flew to America for the first time since leaving as a prisoner 30 years before. Landed in San Antonio and felt the Texas heat wash over her like a memory. Rebecca met her at the airport. Both women were gray now, aged by decades and loss in the weight of remembering. They embraced like the old friends they had somehow become. He talked about you, Rebecca said as they drove through the city. Tom, until the very end, said you were proof that mercy wasn't wasted, that choosing principle over revenge could change the world. They visited Tom's grave, San Antonio National Cemetery. The headstone was simple. Thomas Williams, 1903 to 1974, SGT, U.S. Army. I kept my promise. Yuki placed flowers on the grave, stood there for a long time remembering a Texas afternoon when a grieving father had chosen mercy and changed her life forever. He gave me these, Yuki said, pulling out David's dog tags. After 30 years, she still wore them. I've carried them every day since. Keep them, Rebecca said. That's where they belong. That's how David lives on. Not in metal, but in the choices you've made because of what they mean. They talked for hours about the years between, about Rebecca's work with veterans organizations promoting reconciliation with Japan, about Yuki's teaching her mission to ensure the next generation learn from the past. We're grandmothers now, Rebecca said with a smile. Who would have thought Japanese and American grandmothers friends because of a war that should have made us hate each other forever? David made it possible, Yuki said. Him and your husband. They chose mercy when hate would have been so much easier. No, Rebecca corrected gently. They chose mercy because mercy is never easy. That's what makes it matter. Before Yuki left Texas, Rebecca took her to Fort Sam Houston. The old POW facility was gone, converted to other uses. But they stood where the barracks had been, where chains had fallen in the Texas dust, where everything had changed. What you learned here, Rebecca said, what Tom and David taught you. That's their legacy, not death, not war, but the possibility of peace, the choice to see humanity in enemies, the strength to forgive. Yuki returned to Japan carrying that legacy, carried it back to her classroom, back to her students, back to the next generation who would build the future. And so the years passed. The 1980s arrived. Japan had transformed from ruins to economic power. The young people Yuki taught had never known war, knew it only through stories and history lessons. But Yuki never stopped telling the truth, never stopped holding up those dog tags and explaining what they meant, never stopped teaching that mercy is stronger than hatred, that principles matter more than victory, that we are defined by how we treat our enemies. Which brings us back to where this story began. To that Tokyo classroom in spring 1985. To an elderly teacher with silver hair and fire in her eyes holding a length of rusted chain. September 15th, 1945. Yuki told her students the same story she had told 1,000 times but never tired of telling. They told us Americans would burn us alive. Instead, they treated us like human beings. And that destroyed every lie we had ever been told. She set down the chain, picked up the dog tags. David Williams died at 19 believing in mercy. His father honored him by showing mercy to enemies. His mother chose forgiveness when hatred would have been easier. And I have spent 40 years trying to make their choices mean something. A student raised his hand. Sensei, do you regret anything about the war, about being a prisoner? Yuki thought carefully before answering. I regret that the war happened. I regret the suffering it caused on all sides. I regret that young men like David had to die for the mistakes of old men. I regret that it took chains and captivity and the kindness of enemies to teach me what civilization really means. She paused, looking at each student. But I don't regret what I learned. I don't regret the promise I made. I don't regret spending my life teaching you that mercy is possible, that forgiveness is possible, that we can choose to be better than our worst moments. The bell rang. But as before, no one moved, because they could see in their teacher's eyes that this wasn't just history. This was a truth that mattered, now would always matter, as long as people had to choose between hatred and hope. Remember this, Yuki said as her students finally began to gather their things. The strongest weapon is not bombs or guns, it's principles. It's choosing to stay human even when others become animals. It's treating enemies with dignity, not because they deserve it, but because you do. That's what defeated Japan. Not American firepower, but American principles. And that's what will build the future. Not more war, but more mercy. The students filed out. But one girl, maybe 15, stayed behind. She approached Yuki's desk looking at the chain and dog tags displayed there. "My grandfather fought in the war," the girl said quietly. "He never talked about it. Died with all those stories locked inside. I wish he had met someone like you, Sensei. Someone who could have helped him tell the truth." Yuki touched the girl's shoulder gently. "Then you tell it for him. You learn it. You understand it. You make sure the next generation knows that war is not glorious, that mercy is not weakness, that we must choose carefully who we want to be. That's how we honor the dead. Not by forgetting, by learning." The girl nodded, tears in her eyes, and left. Yuki sat alone in the classroom holding the dog tags. She was 60 years old. Her hair was silver. Her hands showed the age spots and wrinkles of 6 decades. But her eyes still held fire. She thought about Williams dead now for 11 years, about Rebecca aging in Texas, about David eternally 19, his beliefs outliving his body. She thought about the other 42 women, some still alive, some gone, all of them changed by what had happened in a Texas prison camp in 1945, all of them carrying the truth forward. And she thought about tomorrow's students and the day after that and all the years still to come. As long as she had breath, she would tell this story, would hold up these chains and these dog tags and explain what they meant. Because that was her promise. To David, to Williams, to Rebecca, to everyone who had chosen mercy when hatred would have been easier, to make sure that their choice echoed through generations. 13 years later, in 1998, Yuki Tanaka lay in a hospital bed in Tokyo. She was 73 years old. Cancer had finally caught up with her, as it catches up with everyone given enough time. Her children and grandchildren surrounded her. 3 generations, all shaped by the story she had told, the life she had lived, the mission she had carried. Grandmother, her oldest granddaughter, said, holding her hand, "What should we do with your things, the chain, the dog tags?" Yuki's voice was weak but clear. "Donate them to the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum. Let them teach when I no longer can. Let them remind people that even in darkest moments, we have a choice. We can hate or we can heal. We can revenge or we can rebuild. We can become animals or remain human." She looked at each of her family members. "Remember what I taught you. America defeated us with bombs and soldiers, but they won us over with principles and dignity. Never forget that difference. Build your lives on principles, not power. Choose humanity over hatred. That's how you honor those who suffered and those who showed mercy." Her granddaughter asked, "How do you want to be remembered?" Yuki smiled, though it cost her considerable effort. "As someone who learned, who changed, who was brave enough to admit when she was wrong and strong enough to build something better. As someone who believed that mercy is stronger than victory, that forgiveness is harder than hatred, that we choose who we become." She closed her eyes, the dog tags clasped in her hand one final time. "Tell them," she whispered. "Keep telling them. Never stop telling them. That's how peace survives, through the telling." Yuki Tanaka died peacefully that night, surrounded by love, having lived long enough to see Japan rebuilt and reconciled with its past. Having lived long enough to teach thousands of students about mercy and principles and the hard choices that define us. Having lived long enough to keep her promise to a young Marine she never met and the father who had set her free. The chains and dog tags were donated to the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum, where they remain today. Displayed side by side in a glass case. The rusted metal that once bound prisoners. The worn tags that once identified a soldier. Together telling a story more powerful than any weapon. The plaque beneath them reads, "In memory of Sergeant Thomas Williams, 1903 to 1974 CPL. David Williams, USMC, 1925 to 1945. Yuki Tanaka, 1925 to 1998. And all who chose mercy over revenge. You are not animals, Sergeant Williams. September 15th, 1945. These chains once bound 43 Japanese women, prisoners of war at Fort Sam Houston, Texas. When Sergeant Williams unlocked them, he set more than prisoners free. He set mercy free, forgiveness free, hope free. These dog tags belong to his son, who died believing in that mercy. Yuki Tanaka carried them for 50 years, honoring a promise to teach that civilization is measured not by how we treat friends, but how we treat enemies. May their choice echo through generations. May we choose as wisely. May we never forget that we become what we choose to be. Every year, thousands of visitors stand before that display. Japanese students learning about their nation's history. American veterans remembering their service. People from every nation, every background, every belief. They look at the chains and dog tags and read the story, and they face the same question those 43 women faced in 1945. The same question Sergeant Williams faced when he knelt in the Texas dust. The same question Rebecca faced at her son's memorial. Do we hate or do we heal? Do we seek revenge or do we build bridges? Do we become animals or do we remain human? The answer lies not in words but in choices. In the daily difficult, unglamorous work of choosing mercy over bitterness, choosing principle over emotion, choosing to see humanity in those we're supposed to hate. That's what those chains and dog tags represent. Not just a historical event, not just a touching story, but a challenge, a question, a call to action that echoes across decades. What will you choose? In a world that still tears itself apart with hatred and war, with old grievances and new conflicts, with endless cycles of revenge and counter-revenge, the lesson of Fort Sam Houston in 1945 remains as urgent as ever. Mercy is stronger than victory. Forgiveness is harder than hatred. Principles matter more than power. We choose who we become. If this story has moved you, if you believe these lessons matter, if you think the next generation needs to hear about the chains that set mercy free, then share it. Tell it. Pass it forward. Send it to a veteran who served. Send it to a teacher who shapes minds. Send it to a young person who needs to understand that we can be better than our worst impulses. Send it to anyone who has ever struggled with hatred and wondered if forgiveness was possible. Because that's how the legacy continues. Not through museums and monuments alone, but through the telling and retelling of stories that remind us what we can be at our best. Stories like this one, about enemies who became friends, about prisoners who became teachers, about a young Marine whose belief in mercy outlived him, about a Texas sergeant who chose principle over revenge, about 43 Japanese women who learned that civilization is defined by how we treat those we have every right to hate. Remember them, honor them, and most importantly, choose as they chose. Choose mercy, choose humanity, choose hope, because in the end, that's all we have. The choice, always the choice. And the chains that once bound us to hatred can become the very thing that sets us free.